In the final, desperate years of the Second World War, as the Allies closed in from every direction and the Third Reich's promises of a 1,000-year empire collapsed to a handful of months, whispers spread through laboratories, mountain tunnels, and candlelit safe houses. Somewhere in the Sudeten Mountains, under brutal SS supervision and impossible deadlines, a group of scientists had built a device that did not fit the known categories of war. They called it Die Glocke, the bell, not because it rang, but because its smooth, tapering metal shell resembled a church bell sitting on its side, squat and uncanny, a relic from a future that should not exist. The rumor said the machine devoured power like a starving animal, that it glowed with an inner violet light when switched on, that people who stood too close felt a metal taste in their mouths, then nausea, then burns that did not look like ordinary radiation burns. Other rumors said plants exposed to its operation twisted into weird forms, their sap turned to gelatin, their leaves curling like fists. There were stories of animals dropping dead without marks. And there were human stories too, technicians sent home with quiet payments after a week of headaches and little nosebleeds that never stopped, then never came back. The bell entered history not through a signed blueprint or a captured prototype, but as a set of testimonies and fragments, delivered years later by men who had survived long enough to grow old and wonder what it was they had helped create. This is the story of that machine, of its alleged physics, of the men who may have built it, of the tunnels that perhaps still exist beneath damp pine forests, and of what its existence, real, mistaken, or mythic, says about the fever dream of wartime science when it is pushed past ethics into the territory of pure will. Begin with the landscape. The Owl Mountains, the Eulenkeberge, rise like damp shoulders from Silesia, riddled with limestone and riddled further by human hands. The Nazis called their largest underground project there Riese Giant, an unromantic name for concrete caverns blasted into the rock, connected by rails and water channels, guard posts and air shafts, an entire industrial city pushed underground to escape Allied bombers. In those caverns, thousands of slave laborers from camps like Gross Rosen dug and poured and died to build something vast enough to house a secret weapons complex, a last bet on technologies that might reverse the war's momentum. Somewhere near those works, according to later accounts, stood a circle of reinforced concrete pillars that locals would later call the Henge. It looked like the skeletal base of a cooling tower, but unlike a tower's footprint, it had thick column stubs arranged in a precise ring, tied together with concrete architraves and embedded conduits. If it was a water tower base, it was an odd one. If it was a static test stand for something that required extreme force, vibration damping, and cables to restrain it, it made more sense. No one can prove what the hinge was for, but the bell's legend says it was a mooring frame, a way to chain the machine to the earth while it produced forces that otherwise would tear it loose. Now consider the cast of characters, starting with SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler, a civil engineer by training and an organizer by temperament, the man whom Heinrich Himmler put in charge of the Reich's most advanced weapons programs during the final phase of the war. Kammler had authority over the V-2 rocket works, over underground relocations, over secret research budgets, over a bureaucracy of fear that could command engineers and prisoners alike. He had the rare combination of logistics, ruthlessness, and technical literacy needed to move a paper project to a test stand quickly and without questions. He is rumored to have disappeared at the war's end, dying, defecting, or living under another name, depending on which file you believe. If there was a machine as strange as the bell, Kammler was the sort of figure who would have shepherded it into being, protecting it with layers of compartmentalization, moving parts and people like chess pieces, and leaving almost nothing signed. The bell's modern history begins decades after the war, when a Polish journalist named Igor Witkowski claimed access to transcripts from post-war interrogations of an SS officer involved in secret projects. The transcripts allegedly described a device called Die Glocke, made of a hard metal, shaped like a bell, with thick walls and heavy internal structure. Inside were two counter-rotating drums or cylinders, and inside those chambers was a mysterious substance described as Zerum 525, a heavy, purplish metallic compound stored in lid-lined containers. When the cylinder spun at high speed and the power flowed, the device produced a radiant field that killed living things, thickened small amounts of water into something syrupy, and caused crystalline deposits to form on the walls. The test cell had to be lined with ceramic tiles and cooled with brine. Some accounts spoke of prolonged operation producing a glow and a dim halo around metallic objects in the room, as if space itself were being pushed and pulled. Were these colorful lies, misremembered chemical experiments, or a garbled description of some high-voltage, high-speed magneto-hydrodynamic apparatus? The transcripts cannot be cross-verified to the satisfaction of sober historians, but the story had enough texture to attract an aerospace journalist, Nick Cook, who traced the rumors across archives and mountain roads, finding the Henge and finding old men who remembered trains in the night. To understand why anyone would even attempt a machine like this, you must enter the physics imagination of the 1930s and 1940s, a world not yet settled into textbooks. Quantum theory was young. Nuclear fission had just been revealed. Experimenters pushed at the boundaries of vacuum, high voltage, high frequency, and rotating electromagnetic fields, searching for new couplings, new ways to drag phenomena out of the void. There were patents, some serious, some eccentric, on gyroscopic gravitational effects, on vacuum polarization, on the idea that spinning masses and spinning charge distributions could twist space the way a spinning spoon sets water into a vortex. If you believe that gravity and electromagnetism might be linked by undiscovered terms, then a device with counter-rotating masses infused with a dense, conductive fluid and driven by colossal power might be a speculative way to test it. The rumored Zerum 525 has been described variously as a thorium or uranium salt suspended in mercury, or as mercury enriched with radioactive isotopes, or as a bismuth-mercury amalgam with unusual diamagnetic properties. Mercury itself is dense, conductive, and responds dramatically to magnetic fields. Force it into a torus and drive it with pulsed electricity, and you can create vicious eddies and induced currents, a man-made storm inside a sealed drum. Add radioisotopes and you will also add deadly radiation and ionizing ozone, which might account for sickness, burns, and the need for ceramic linings. But none of that proves anti-gravity, time travel, or dimensional gateways. It simply proves that a hasty wartime lab could be a lethal place to work. The Bell legend's technical details cluster around a few repeated motifs. 2 heavy drums spinning in opposite directions at thousands of revolutions per minute. A cryogenic or brine cooling system to keep components from burning up. Massive high-voltage power supplies fed by generators or by tapping local hydroelectric stations. And a core working fluid that was exotic, dense, and toxic. When the machine ran, experiments had to be limited to less than a minute at first, then extended to 2 minutes, then to 5, as if the team were creeping up on a threshold that could not be crossed safely. An inner radiation shield of lead bricks and an outer wall of ceramic tiles were said to be standard precautions. People nearby wore thick rubber suits and face shields. There is testimony, hearsay stacked on hearsay, that 5 scientists died during early tests and were quietly buried under false names. There is also the darker claim that some prisoners were exposed to the machine deliberately to measure physiological effects. Here, the Bell intersects the wider and fully documented horror of Nazi medical crimes. Whether or not the specific Bell claim is true, the regime certainly used captive human beings as experimental material when it thought results would accelerate a weapon or a doctrine. That fact makes every rumor harder to dismiss with a clean conscience. What could such a machine do if it existed as described? The sober answer is that it would generate extreme electromagnetic fields and violent fluid dynamics inside the drums, with substantial X-ray or gamma emissions if radioisotopes were present, plus ozone, nitric oxides, and a spectral corona if potentials were high enough. Those conditions can cause biological injury and weird chemical effects. A leaf cells might be ruptured by radical cascades, turning its sap to gelatin. Fats could peroxidize, proteins could denature. The smell of singed metal might actually be the smell of ionized air and outgassed coatings. The concrete hinge, if it was a test stand, might have been designed to anchor a heavy device while distributing vibration through many columns, with water flowing through pipes to quench heat. The exposed electric lines seen in old photos could have fed power or carried instrumentation signals. None of this requires exotic physics. And yet, the more colorful claims persist because they fulfill an archetype. The dream of a war-ending breakthrough, a Promethean theft of a force that does not belong to mortals. Some storytellers connect the Bell to Project Kronos, an alleged code name hinted in a stray document implying time experiments. Others link it to the Kecksburg incident of 1965, when witnesses in Pennsylvania saw a fiery object pass overhead and crash in the woods, then reported a swift military response and removal of a bell-shaped object under a tarpaulin. The geometry in witness sketches bears a family resemblance to the mythic machine, so the narrative binds them. The Nazis built a bell. It vanished with Kammler. After the war, the United States continued the work in the black world. In the 60s, something went wrong and it fell out of the sky. Is this a tidy alignment of unrelated bell shapes, or a plausible arc of technology transfer from a defeated regime to a victorious one hungry for any edge in a new Cold War? It is not necessary to believe the strongest version of the story to admit that history is crowded with genuine transfers of knowledge. The V-2 became the foundation of American and Soviet rocketry. German aerodynamics papers seeded supersonic research. Nerve agents discovered by Nazi chemists became grim entries in Western stockpiles. Operation Paperclip is documented, not legendary. It would be naive to assume that anything the Allies captured in Silesia was politely left behind if it appeared useful. Return to Kammler for a moment. One version of his end says he shot himself. Another says he slipped into American hands and exchanged something valuable for his life. A third says the Soviets took him. A fourth says he simply vanished. The file is inconsistent, the provenance murky. That makes him a convenient axis for many theories, the perfect courier for an extinguished empire's last secrets. If a device existed, and if it could not be moved easily during the final retreats of 1945, components might have been destroyed in place while notebooks and key personnel took trains in the opposite direction under assumed names. Riese's tunnels were partially flooded and sealed. The Henge stood above ground, stripped of its original fittings. Locals scavenged cable runs. The forest took back what it could. The bones of that underground city remain as mute witnesses that something enormous was planned there, something that required concrete by the river and human beings by the thousand. Whether the bell sat under those arches is the question that the forest refuses to answer. The physics claims deserve one more sober pass. There are fringe theories claiming that rotating superconductors produce gravitational anomalies, a line of experiment associated in later decades with controversial figures and unreplicated results. There are papers on the lens tearing effect, a tiny frame dragging predicted by general relativity and confirmed decades later by satellites. A spinning mass does indeed twist nearby spacetime, but the magnitude for laboratory masses is unbelievably small. No combination of drums and mercury that could fit in a building would produce measurable anti-gravity according to standard theory. If the bell did lift slightly or vibrate in strange ways, those effects would likely be electromagnetic forces coupling into surrounding steel, or acoustic standing waves, or thermal updrafts, not gravity turning traitor. Still, in the atmosphere of 1944, with the V-2 arching into London and jet fighters howling over the Rhine, it is not hard to see how a regime that had already bet on long shots might allocate funds to one more device with a seductive promise. The men who ran that regime often believed that will could substitute for reality. There is also the question of names. Zerum 525 reads like a stylized code for mercury, but the number invites speculation. Isotope mass? Mixture code? Production batch? Red mercury is a later Cold War myth, a non-existent super-explosive fraud used by con men to fleece governments, but its imagery, dense, scarlet mercury that can trigger fusion, echoes backward into the Bell story and stains it red. Bismuth appears in some accounts as layered wafers combined with magnesium and stratified like a metamaterial. Modern UFO lore has adopted bismuth-magnesium layers as a kind of talismanic artifact. This rhetorical recycling shows how technological myths cross-pollinate. Real materials today can manipulate microwaves and terahertz waves using pattern layers. That does not retroactively grant anti-gravity to a wartime device. Yet the mind reaches for continuity, for hidden threads that tie the outlandish present to the outlandish past. What then remains when the theatrical fog is cleared? First, a documented network of underground complexes in Silesia built at horrendous human cost, equipped to host secret industry. Second, a cluster of post-war testimonies in secondary sources naming a bell-shaped device powered by rotating fields and exotic fluids. Third, a peculiar concrete ring, the Henge, whose purpose is unclear but whose mass and geometry suggested anchored heavy equipment with serious vibration. Fourth, the disappearance or ambiguous fate of an SS general who oversaw exotic weapons. Fifth, a Cold War culture of secrecy in which victorious powers did indeed scavenge and continue German research in rocketry, aerodynamics, medicine, and possibly more speculative domains. These data points do not prove a time machine. They do not even prove an anti-gravity experiment. They do, however, outline a space in which a desperate regime might have funded a high-energy, high-risk program whose traces were mostly deliberately erased. Imagine the night a test took place. Snow is blown sideways across the forest. A convoy crawls up the road with its lights shaded. In the concrete circle, floodlights flick on, each lamp haloed by ice crystals. 10 men in heavy rubber suits check clamps, cables, and hoses. A crane lowers the bell under the architraves, then withdraws. The device sits like a squat idol, dull metal beaded with condensation. Inside, the drums are balanced and primed, the fluid has been purged of air, the cooling loop circulates brine through heat exchangers. In a brick building 30 meters away, a senior scientist with a bald head and red eyes gives a nod. Power becomes an intention, then a physical flood. Motors whine, then scream. The bell hums. A violet sheen crawls along its surface like heat lightning trapped inside a shell. The brine line knocks in its clamps. An assistant steps back and tastes pennies. A technician in the control room pinches his nose and feels blood on his gloves. 30 seconds, someone says. The hum becomes a shiver in the ribs, a sensation of something pressing down, like a coming thunderstorm. Ceramic tiles on the test cell walls creak. At 40 seconds, the senior scientist raises his hand and the power drops. The violet goes out like a held breath released. Somewhere far above, a panicked bird bursts from a tree and vanishes into darkness. Would such a scene leave records? In ordinary times, yes. Logs, duty rosters, procurement ledgers, shipping crates. In the endgame of a lost war, perhaps not. In those months, paper burned by the truckload, trains went missing, orders were barked without leaving signatures. The bell is plausible in its bureaucracy and impossible in its physics, or plausible in its physics and impossible in its bureaucracy, or a ghost assembled from shards by people who wanted a ghost. The fascination endures because it sits at the intersection of three appetites. Our appetite for secret weapons that nearly changed history, our appetite for exotic physics that might still change it, and our appetite for a morality play in which hubris is punished by disappearance. After the capitulation, the Owl Mountains returned to silence. Locals explored shallow tunnels and found nothing but damp air and rust. The Henge remained as a curiosity. Hikers told tales. Engineers shook their heads. Journalists took photographs of the ring at dawn when the shadows were long and the concrete looked like the bones of a slain giant. Tour guides developed careful spiels about what might have been and what almost certainly was not. Meanwhile, the idea of the bell slipped into novels and forums, into late-night radio and online videos where the narrator's voice drops a half step on the words anti-gravity, where archival footage of V-2s and jet fighters supplies a visual soundtrack to a set of claims that cannot be overlaid on any surviving blueprint. The story grows because it is well-shaped. A bell, a bunker, a genius monster with a foggy death certificate, a ring of concrete waiting like an altar, a liquid that glows, a forest that keeps its mouth shut. There is, however, a more grounded moral available. War accelerates invention by burning people and money in huge engines and by promising that ethics can be deferred until victory. In that furnace, sane lines of research leap forward dangerously fast, and insane lines of research are funded long enough to hurt everyone standing nearby. Whether the bell existed, the regime that might have built it certainly existed and did build other machines. Rockets that carry tons of explosive over cities, jet aircraft too late to matter, submarines that starved Britain briefly, chemical factories that gassed prisoners while calling it science. The true mystery machine is not a bell of metal, it is the bureaucracy that can transform imagination into concrete and corpses in 18 months. That machine has been built more than once in more than one country. It can be admired for its efficiency and loathed for its purpose at the same time. When we search the mountains for the bell, we are also searching for certainty that such a device would have solved a problem, ended a war, justified its costs. History never gives us that gift. It gives us testimonies that do not agree, ruins that do not confess, and families with missing names. If you listen closely to the bell story, you can hear the echo of something that is undeniably true. Superior organization is as decisive as superior science. If Kammler mattered, it was because his ledger books and his trains mattered. If the Henge mattered, it was because concrete arrives before miracles. If Zerum 525 mattered, it was because someone got a requisition approved for barrels, tiles, lead pigs, and brine pumps. These facts are not romantic, but they are where legends touch the ground. They explain how a rumor can survive. It hangs on the ribs of real structures and real hierarchies, clothed in imaginative meat. Even skeptics admit that something large was attempted underground in Silesia, and that we know less about it than we should, because the dead rarely leave memos. In the end, whether you believe the bell hovered, melted leaves, or merely stank of ozone, the image has done its work on you. You can see it now in your mind, the squat metallic shell, the cables, the breath of winter in a beam of searchlight, the hiss of cooling lines, the inner glow like a storm trapped inside a bell jar, the men flinching, the hand cutting the power, the silence after. You can feel the pull of wish and fear, the wish that there is a door somewhere we have not opened, and the fear that someone already opened it long ago and did not like what stepped through. Perhaps that is the true function of the story, not to tell us that the Nazis built a time machine, but to force us to ask what we would do with the power to bend the laws we teach our children. Would we restrain ourselves where they did not? Would we bury the machine and burn the papers and walk away? Or would we lower it onto a ring of concrete, feed it 1 more megawatt, and see what happens this time? So the bell rings without sound across the decades because we ring it ourselves, striking it with curiosity and hearing our own questions come back. The owl mountains, the Henge, the rumors, the old men with careful memories, the journalists with careful doubts, they form the clapper and the shell. The tone is low and sustained. How close did we come to a science we cannot handle? How easily do we invent a science to match our myths? How quickly does war transform maybes into musts? On some future day, a historian may find a notebook in an attic, its ink faded but legible, full of diagrams and power curves and casualty lists, and the argument will shift. Until then, the bell stays poised between the possible and the poetic, a machine we use to interrogate both physics and ourselves. If you go there, to the ring of columns half hidden by trees, stand in the center and look up at the sky framed by concrete, and imagine the cables pulled taut, the hum rising, the light thickening around you. Ask yourself, not whether it flew, but why you want it to have flown. And then listen, because in the wind over the mountains and the drip of water from the old forms, you may hear the only honest answer the past can give. We built many strange things, but the strangest of all is the belief that a machine will save us from the consequences of our choices.